first time ever.
Hear you loud and clearly.
And it was going place.
That stuff's great.
But the game is not a roguelike.
Boomer shooter.
Bang.
Hello, this is John St. John, and you're listening to KEEP In the Keep, bringing you all the hits from the finest in the world of gaming and entertainment. Now sit back and relax as the drowned god Cthulhu lulls your mind with the tastiest talk in town.
Welcome to In the Keep with your host, Richard, the Fear Merchant, the Curator of the Void, the Librarian of the Drowned God Cthulhu, with very special guests today, the Motherlode for the Simulcast with the Bazaar Cast. The Motherlode, welcome to your own show.
Okay. The Bazaar Cast features adult themes and language that you may not find suitable for small children. I am your host, the Motherlode, Ty Brannon, and I will be interviewing today the wonderful Mr. Richard Martin of In the Keep podcast. How are you today?
I'm absolutely fantastic. A pleasure to be in my own home.
I am really, really well. It's been a hell of a day, but I'm happy to be spending the end of it, or maybe the middle of it. Who knows how long I'll be up with you. Been looking forward to this for a week now, something like that.
Yes, yeah. So, it's hard. It's hard with the time zones. For those who listen to me a lot, I'm based down in Australia, an Irishman down under, and yeah, I like to make podcasts in my spare time for the last almost 5 years in November. So have a bit of a birthday coming up. I should be kind of well past pre-K and in school at the moment. If a podcast was a little human being, it's definitely my baby. Ty, would you like to introduce yourself to the Bazaar Cast crew?
Yeah, I just burned myself with coffee, so I might sound a little funny as I do so. But yeah, so I'm Ty. I guess professionally known as the Motherlode is just because that was my Quake tag and it stuck. And for some reason, when I first started podcasting, I thought it was important to protect my identity as if that would ever work, being on camera and doing other stupid shit. I am the founder and CEO of In the Keep, which is a small blossoming game studio / publisher. And we obviously produce lots of content related to games like videos and podcasts and all that kind of shit. Up until recently, I was professionally also a meteorologist full-time, working with the Air Force. So that's a part of my life that I'm now finally getting to shut the door on and move on. And I have recently started full-time as a producer with 3D Realms. So there's probably some other stuff I'm missing. My LinkedIn profile is awful. But
There's definitely plenty to dig into there, given you are the Motherlode. Well, that's the Motherlode LOAD. It's not LODE.
Oh, you caught on to that. That's very, very observant of you.
Because
yes.
I was going to say, I'm going down this rabbit hole the last few months. The Motherlode of content is definitely coming from the Doom community at the moment. The last couple episodes I've had, I definitely have a thread line to them, and they've led me to yourself today now. Well, more, you've actually come to my doorstep, which is unusual for the Bazaar Cast. I'm usually the one out with my pickaxe looking for the next Motherlode.
Well, I saw, I guess it was on Twitter or something, that Bridgeburner was on your podcast, and honestly, my gut reaction was like, who the fuck is this guy? That's my guest. I'm just kidding, but you can we curse on your show?
Yeah,
I think I said that we use foul language. But
there is foul language. I
recall you saying lots of it in the interviews that I've listened to. But regardless, yes. Yeah, I saw that one, and I was like, wow, that's cool. Bridgeburner did a podcast on someone else's platform, that motherfucker. So I went and I listened to it, and it was amazing. And then, lo and behold, shortly thereafter, you had John Romero on, which was also a really fantastic interview. We said this a little bit beforehand, but I really admired the fact that you didn't do the very painful rehashing of, okay, what was it like when you made Wolfenstein? What was it like when you made Doom? And that, who cares? But it was so good. Then I ended up going back and listening to a few more. I'm about halfway through your interview with Stephen Kick right now. And I also admire the fact that many of your guests are not like what you'd call really famous people. You know, sometimes it's just like, oh, I'll interview the guy who makes t-shirts in town or whatever. And like, that's awesome. That to me is like so much more interesting than just hearing the same rehashing of the same interview that some famous guy has done 100 times and doesn't care to hear, you know, the same questions anymore. He's done.
That's definitely part of the philosophy of the Bazaar Cast. So I can give you maybe a little bit of a history lesson if anyone cares to listen to us today. So it started off, like you obviously saw on Twitter, it's the Fear Merchant is the handle there. And I introduced myself. So that we'll cast ourselves back to 2015. Self and a few friends are live streaming on a Ustream. I think that's now defunct. I haven't heard of that in a while. Right. Some Resident Evil. And we were talking about Resident Evil 4. And we were like, oh, that guy, the merchant in that is like, oh, he's like the Fear Merchant. Oh, a very nice tattoo there of Umbrella. And we were like, oh, that guy's the Fear Merchant. And I was like, wow, that just has a ring to it. So we said, yeah, look, let's make a Twitter, the Fear Merchant. And every time we're streaming, we'll tweet out, blah, blah, blah. And then it kind of started like taking legs from there. This horror outfit in the UK was a publication. They were looking for new writers to review movies and books and everything. So I was like, oh, hey, I know you're looking for people in the UK. What about Ireland? And they're like, yeah, the more the merrier, you know, send us, just do a review of something and we'll read it and see how you get on. So I was like, yeah, look. So then I started doing reviews, but he was like, look, no one wants to review any of the independent stuff or the short movies. Right. Would you be interested in doing that? And I said, yeah, I'll do that. So for maybe 7 months, I was, you know, writing about all these really good short stories and short movies. And I was like finding the people on Twitter and tagging them when their reviews came up, and they were like, oh, thank you very much. You know, like they were all getting exposure. Right. And I was listening to a few podcasts and I was like, God, these guys sound like really shit. I could do something better. So then I was like, all right, so I'm the Fear Merchant. So I was like, what could it be? And I was like, the Bazaar. It's like the Fear Merchant's Bazaar. So it was meant to be like a place where people would show off their wares, and it was meant to be like an independent creator podcast. So it was like the Bazaar Cast is where people come to meet and share their ideas. So for the first in November, then I had such a back catalog of potential guests from doing the reviews. I pretty much had the next year of content. So for 2 years straight, I was doing independent horror creators, like music, TV shows, you name it. I was getting people out in front. And then I moved down to Australia, and I sort of began to drop the Fear Merchant part, and it just became the Bazaar Cast. Yeah. And I got a co-host then in Australia because I couldn't do as frequent. It was every 2 weeks, like clockwork. And had a co-host for a while. We really tried to push the boat out there. We ended up disbanding that outfit. And then for the last 2 years, I've been taking it at my leisure and releasing when I see fit and when guests are fit to chat with, like yourself. So that's a short history lesson of the Bazaar Cast and where it got its name. So what about In the Keep? Would you like to give a brief history lesson?
Well, as you saw before we started recording, I couldn't even tell you what year it started. But so I started In the Keep as a Discord server that's sole purpose was to, you know, network with people who wanted to play Quake and to kind of be able to quickly ping and be like, let's, you know, find a match with someone who's not a dick, which is hard to find in online gaming, and who's willing to either teach or, you know, at your skill level so you could play. And I was so obsessed with Quake at this time. This is in about maybe 2018, late 2017, early 2018, when this really kind of kicked off, because Quake Champions had just come out. And I've always been a huge podcast nut ever since podcasting really became a thing. I'm a huge fan of Joe Rogan. At the time, I was very into The Art of Wrestling with Colt Cabana and, Mark Maron, all the greats, everybody that's ever kicked ass and took names. But I found this small podcast called The State of Quake. It was hosted by two wonderful fellas named, they go by Unkind and Slip.
Okay.
And it was sort of not really, they did a couple of interviews, but it was exactly what it sounds like, The State of Quake. What are the newest updates? What's going on? What are the changes to the characters? Blah, blah, blah. And they were really, really good. They've just dove into every detail, and they were really fucking entertaining. Like, just, I remember Slip being one of the funniest people I'd ever heard. And I'd also never heard a professional broadcaster who had as deep a Southern accent or worse than mine.
Right.
So it was
You're not too bad. I can definitely understand you.
Right. I've tailored it over the years for sure. I've definitely evolved into a better public speaker than I was maybe 5-6 years ago. But they were so damn good, but they were really bad at turning out content on time. And they were also putting on tournaments, and I was playing in a lot of them, and, just trying to learn the game, because I was kind of a newcomer, at least to like proper Quake playing. I had tooled around, but I didn't even understand strafe jumping or anything at the time. So they were teaching me how to rocket jump and all this kind of crazy, all the fun things about Quake. And I got to know them pretty well. And I just couldn't stand that every week my favorite podcast wasn't putting out an episode. So, we were networking so well. We knew so many people. I was like, why don't we do like interviews? If you guys can't be in this, in the same place to record an episode every week, like just do some interviews with different people, and it could be either of you. And then that wasn't going to happen. So then I was like, well, what if I did it and I just send you the audio file and you package it up and send it out as a podcast? And then they were like, yeah, sure. Fuck it. We'll do that. So I did that for, I think, 5 episodes before I just couldn't handle not being in complete control of it.
Yeah.
So
I know the feeling.
So I requested that Unkind send me all of the MP3s from the prior episodes, and we did like a quick handover. I very quickly learned how to use basic editing tools, and In the Keep was born, and I just went nuts with it. And it started off primarily about arena FPS, like Quake, Unreal. I think I had Open Arena, Duskworld when that first came out, like people who played those games. But the well runneth dry on arena FPS. And then I started getting people from the boomer shooter community reaching out like, hey, you want to interview me? I'm like, fuck yeah, I do. Who cares? And then it just transitioned from there into a full on just general indie gaming podcast. And that's one thing that I really admired about what you were saying a few minutes ago, is that you have pivoted your brand multiple times into like whatever you were interested in. And I found that very difficult at first, because I kind of built an audience on first person shooters. And then I felt guilty if I wanted to talk about, RTS or just horror in general or whatever. And I've completely shed that fear now. But at the time it was like, I don't want to alienate my core audience. And
I was the same. Yeah. But I actually felt like there wasn't much of a fall off when it was changing, because as I was saying to you off air before we started, like, I think if people want to listen to you and they find what you say interesting, it doesn't matter if you're talking about how to cut your grass. As long as you're captivating enough, people might just go over and listen. Some people they're not even listening for the content. Like, I listen to a lot of podcasts just before going to bed, just for like white noise. I don't even mind if people are listening to me to go to sleep. Maybe they find my voice very drony and boring that sends them right to sleep. And the more the merrier. I can pivot into a mindfulness podcast next week if the sponsorships for like Headspace or something, not sponsored by the way, guys, come my way. I definitely had the same fear, because I don't know, you just get into a pattern, especially if you're like regular, you're like, I gotta do it for the fans. But unless you have hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line to like get podcasts out, I think everyone needs to take a chill pill, because everyone and their mother has a podcast now. I feel like at the time 5 years ago, everyone had a podcast then, but even the cats and dogs have podcasts now. It's like everyone is doing one. So I'm like, oh, look, whoever wants to listen listens. And that's just kind of how it goes. But Ty, you are older than 3 years old. So maybe give your audience a little bit of a background into yourself before the podcast. You were mentioning you're in the Air Force. So maybe tell us a story, sow the seeds. Where does baby Ty to teenager Ty, where does that all go?
Okay, this is awkward because I don't think I've ever openly addressed the military to my audience before.
We're getting the scoop today. We're getting the scoop.
Yeah, here you go. This is your big scoop. I've kept a secret from all of you this entire time. Because like I said, I just didn't feel comfortable talking about the military. I didn't want that to be my identity, and I also didn't want to get a knock on the door from public affairs being like, hey, you're cussing a lot. We don't want the people thinking that airmen or whatever. And that was a bit of a thing. But
it's like, those are the sailors, son.
Yes. No, I grew up in a small town in Alabama, just north of Mobile. If anyone's ever heard of Mobile, it's a port city in the it's the left pussy lip of Alabama, if you're looking at a map.
Is that how people talk about Alabama in Alabama?
That's how I talk about it. So, and it was kind of a, really redneck kind of life for the first 10 years or so until I became a teenager. And then I started getting into hard rock and heavy metal. And then I became like the weird fucking goth guy walking down the street next to a bunch of cornfields and pine forests and stuff like that. And there was a lot, I don't want to go into my whole life story there, but I grew up very, I wouldn't say isolated, but I was a very introspective kid, and that I rejected all things authority, and I was a shitty teenager, and I made my mom cry a lot. But she still loves me, and I still love her very much, and we're much better now. By the time I was 17, I had decided that I wanted nothing more in the world than to be a professional wrestler. So I committed every ounce of all my college money, every bit of it. I went to train under Mr. Curtis in Atlanta for like a week just to get an introduction. And then I hired a full-time trainer back in my hometown. His name was the Gothic Warrior, Dalton Cross. And
very on brand for you at the time.
And I wanted to be CM Punk so bad I could taste it. And I wrestled all over the Southeast, and Georgia. Well, not Georgia. I didn't really have any matches in Georgia. Northern Alabama, Florida, Southern Mississippi. Never made it anywhere or did anything super special, but I had a lot of fun and I learned a lot about life doing that. And I did that until I was about 20 years old. I got hit in the head with a steel chair one time. It really cracked me open, had some staples in the head, a little bit of a concussion there. And I had to make a decision about like, is this really going to be a career for me? And meanwhile, I had also taken on an apprenticeship with an electrician. So I was doing that and hating it, getting underpaid. I loved my boss, but I hated everyone else that I worked with. They were just the trashiest trash human beings I've ever met in my entire life.
Right.
And fuck all of you. You suck. And that made me I was looking for any route out of that job. So I joined the Air Force. I tested really well on the initial ASVAB scores, and they wanted me to be a cryptolinguist, which is essentially someone who learns a foreign language and, then I guess spies on the people who speak that language who may or may not be bad guys.
Okay.
And I thought that sounded really dope. So my first, trip after basic training was straight to Monterey, California at a place called the Defense Language Institute, and I was assigned to learn the Iraqi dialect of Arabic, and it was a brand new program. Generally speaking, people just learned modern standard Arabic or Levantine Arabic, which is more like the Levant. Yeah, and I epically failed. Like I did so poorly in school that it, about 5 or 6 months in, they sat me down. And they're like, "We might need to find another path." And I was like, I agree. I had been already going to my first sergeant, every week and be like, you got to get me out of this shit. I can't do this anymore. And he's just like, just plug it through until they decide to let you go. That way it doesn't look like you quit, which was great advice. He was absolutely right. And so they reassigned me to weather. And when I got to weather, I felt like, science was probably more my speed anyway. I still love linguistics and all, but at the speed that they wanted you to learn it, I could not. It was like drinking from a fire hose. So I go to weather school for 8-9 months, very fast paced program. And I did okay. And then I got into the career field itself, once I got stationed here in Arizona. And I wouldn't say I loved the job, but I definitely loved the science of it and being able to draw meteorological charts and analyze fronts and tell the future. Like that all felt really, really cool and powerful. And so that's been the past 4 years of my life is doing that. And while the job itself made me miserable with the shift work and the blah, 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 everything else going on, I needed a hobby. So I started playing games and I started a podcast and then a company. And then now here we are talking. So.
Amazing. That was a very succinct life story there. Appreciate that.
Yeah. What about you, man?
Yeah. I won't lie. I had a fairly charmed upbringing, I suppose. There wasn't much chaos besides parental divorce, but what's new in the world these days? It was, good. Went to school in Ireland, which, a fairly cozy country. There isn't much, it's fairly homogenous.
Homeland.
Yeah, the homeland. So grew up in the city, did the normal stuff like you do, went to college, studied biochemistry, got out of that, couldn't get a job. So the girlfriend at the time, now wife, she moved up I'm from down south, down in Cork, and she moved up to Dublin for an accountancy, apprenticeship, I suppose you could call it. And we were kind of doing the long distance for 2 years. And then she was like, you need to shit or get off the pot here. Are you moving up to Dublin? And I was running a business at the time. It was a gym. And that was just not going anywhere. There was trouble with the landlord, outside of my hands kind of thing. And I was just like, oh, look, it's time to pack up and move on. So we were up there for 2 years. I was working in sales and stuff for a scientific instruments company, selling stuff to universities. So I was jet setting all over Europe. And everyone's like, oh, wow, you get to travel with work. That's amazing. You get to see all these different cities in Europe and stuff. I was like, no, I get to see a shitty hotel room. And I just get to go into a lab and say, hi, will you buy my wares? Fittingly ties into the fear merchant. I was just trying to sell a load of shit. And did that for 2 years. Absolutely hated it. My now wife was like, I fucking hate this company. My apprenticeship's up, in May. We need a change of scenery. So we were having a few beers one winter's night in December, and we were like, what's going to happen? What are we going to do? We're miserable. And we said, why don't we move? And we settled on Australia because Canada's too cold. America is out of the frying pan into the fire. You guys don't seem to have good working conditions. You don't give enough annual leave. And you're like, yeah, we'll go to Australia. So I've been down here the last 3 years, working for a medical device company, working in the regulatory department there, keeping things tidy. And typical 9 to 5, doesn't stimulate me too much, but I enjoy my free time after that. So it's kind of waiting to hit the lottery, get my little homestead going. So that's the pipe dream at the moment, and make podcasts in my spare time. That's kind of where I'm at. But it's kind of funny, seeing the life behind the voice sometimes. It's oh, that's just Joe Soap.
Yeah.
Could be like me. But yeah, no, just working away. Nothing too exciting.
There are so many people out there who are doing mundane jobs that just never take that step to try something different, even if it's just a hobby. And it bothers me. I talk to people all the time who, amongst my peers, I'm not in any way under the impression that I'm special, but they'd be like, oh my God, you went to Europe and you'd what the fuck, dude? And how did you do it? And I'm like, I just fucking sat down and did it until like my fingers bled. And that's how it happens. Like you can't just, I hate it when people are like, I wish I could play the guitar. I'm like, well, just fucking play the guitar. Do it now. Stop whining.
No, like I get it. Cause you know, there's a lot of people, they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go to, cause you know, it's a really big thing in Ireland for people to go to Australia for a year with the visa. And, you know, there's been tons of people who are like, oh yeah, like I'm definitely going to go to Canada for a year. I'm definitely going to go to New Zealand. I'm definitely going to go to Australia. And it's like, but why didn't you go? And it's like 3 years later. And some people are like, oh, I'm saving for that apartment. I'm saving for this house. You know, everything is just like put on the long finger. And we're the kind of couple who we're just like, look, if we say we're going to do something, we're going to do it. And people were shocked that we were leaving because we said it like that Christmas. And they're like, yeah, we're going to move to Australia. And they're like, yeah, you sure are. Like, get lost. And then we were kind of leaving in July. They were like, what? You're really going? And it's been 3 years later. Like, I haven't been back. Pandemic notwithstanding, I don't think I would have been back anyway. Because people are like, oh, why don't you come back for like a visit? I'm like, I'm not paying like $5,000 to have like a cup of tea and or a pint. I'm like, you can go fly up your own arse, basically. You know, it's just like people need to do stuff, I guess. Like just as you said, it's there's a lot of like dreamers out there. I hate to be disparaging about people, but I call them like automatons. They're the type of people who are going to wake up when they're like 40 and have the stereotypical like midlife crisis of like, oh my God, I've been sleepwalking all through my life. They might have like a wife and kids who they don't know, not necessarily hate. They're just like, they just wake up and they're like, what? Like, I've seen it happen so many times. I'm like, how, you know, they're like, oh, once I retire, I'll get to X, Y, and Z. I'm like, but what are you going to do from 20 to 65? Like you have a full life there. Because we always like try and, you know, like we obviously have like our saving goals and X, Y, and Z, but it's like, but we need that like 15% of the budget to be like, let's go on like a little holiday to like break up the monotony or something. Like you have to kind of treat yourself along the way, not excessively, but it's like do things. Like, I don't know, life's too short. Like I'm really like a nihilist of like, there's nothing after you die or anything. I'm just like, there's a one life for living, so you might as well like live it. Because I don't want to be like 65 decrepit and finally get to go on holidays. I'm like, no, I want to be able to like run up Machu Picchu or something if I ever get to South America. It's like I want to be a sprightly young fellow while I'm doing the traveling, not an old man.
People are generally, I would say, addicted to security, and they just are too paralyzed by the fear of giving up that security to ever try anything new. And I've been pretty blessed because I've managed to kind of have both for most of my adult life. So it's hard to say. It's not like I was, what's that guy from the guy that like went to Alaska and died in a bus, you know, he just like burned up his credit card and his car and all of his money and his birth certificate and just went crazy and just did whatever he wanted for like a few years.
Oh, I haven't heard about this.
It's appealing.
This guy.
Oh, Into the Wild is the name of the book. Now that I'm thinking, there's also a really good movie about it. But yeah, he was just like he was graduated business school or something like that, or law school. His parents were rich. He had everything going for him, and he just said, "Fuck this," and then he just goes like nuts, kayaks down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, travels all around, you know, finds odd jobs here and there enough to get by. And then he's like, I'm going to Alaska. And then he just goes to Alaska and he's like, I'm going to go live out in the wilderness by myself. And he did fairly well for a little while until the winter came. And then he, I believe the river next to him flooded and he couldn't get out when it got too bad. And then he didn't bring a map because he was so goddamn arrogant. He's like, I don't need a map. I can do anything. And then if he had brought a map, he would have noticed that about 2 miles upstream, there was a way across. He could have gotten out, but hey, you live and learn. That's all there is to it.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Yeah, no, life is kind of funny. Yeah, obviously I'm more adventurous. I'm like the antipode of Ireland at the moment. But yeah, no, I think it's like good. It's just more like with, as I mentioned, like the business and stuff at the time failing and stuff, like there was so much stress there. There was like, you know, business debt associated with it. And it was just like boom, boom, boom. So I think like my stress my pituitary gland or something in my brain is just like fried. So I don't get stressed anymore. Like nothing stresses me. Like I got some good advice from my dad at the time. He was just like, because, there was like the tax man knocking at the door and like, where's our money kind of stuff. And I was like, oh my God, how are we going to pay them? And he just said, like, are they going to come in and kill you? And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, are you going to die if you don't pay this today? And I was like, no, I guess. Like, I don't think the tax man's going to shoot me in the head. And he was like, yeah, so relax. Like, you're not going to die. And I've like really taken that advice to heart. I'm like, if you think of a stressful situation and you're like, actually, am I going to die? And you're like, no. And it's like, well, just relax then. Like, what's the worst that can happen? Come back tomorrow. Like, they're not going to do anything. So I'm like, oh yeah. And especially now with like the day-to-day work, I work with like field actions and recalls and stuff. So you might get like a business manager being like, oh my God, the defibrillators, they're on recall. Like, the battery's defective, X, Y, and Z. Like, this is like terrible. And I pretty much look at like one recall a week, every week. I'm a team of one, and it's meant to be a team of 2.5. And I'm just like, yeah, relax. Like, I don't smoke, but it'd be like the proverbial, like, relax, man. Like, I got this. Don't worry. It's like, tell your customers that it's all about like, we're really up on our vigilance and we look after your safety. And they're like, oh, thank God. Because I used to be in sales as well. So I know how to talk to the salespeople. So like, I've worked in call centers and everything. So I've done all sorts of odd jobs. Like I worked in America in New York City for a summer as well, like doing flooring and it's all like,
fuck that.
Yeah. So I've done like all sorts, I can, what's the Rudyard Kipling poem, It's like, if you can talk with the common man and talk with kings nor lose the common touch sort of thing. I can just like chill with anyone really. Like, I don't know, would you say like a social chameleon? I'm definitely not. I'm just like, I'm always myself. And as you mentioned earlier, like I can kind of massage things out of people when I talk to them because I make them feel cozy, I suppose. I don't really know. I haven't talked to myself, so I don't know how charming I can be, whether I'm charming or not. I don't know.
Yeah, there's definitely an X factor to that. I don't want to say, oh, I'm not super special or anything, but clearly I've done a pretty good job of getting people to feel comfortable enough to talk to me about sometimes pretty intimate shit. And I think that's what makes any podcast that's centered around interviewing people really good and special, is that you're not just hearing, and then I did this, and then I did that. It's like, there's some humanity to it. There's a little bit of soul in there. And that's a talent. I don't even know that it's a skill. I'm not sure that anyone can like learn how to do that necessarily. I couldn't teach a master course on it if my life depended on it.
Yeah. Because I've seen like lots of podcasts and stuff like go by the wayside, that they started off and they had like, everyone has the greatest idea, but I went like said it with a friend before, and like, two guys drinking beer podcast is like, those are always like really crap. I'm like, oh, let's talk about Halloween. Let's talk about The Thing. Let's talk about Nightmare on Elm Street. And I'm like, yeah, but like there's another 5,000 podcasts that done that. And after 50 episodes, you're like pulling up garbage, like just, that's why I sort of pivoted as well. Cause I felt like the wells were running dry, or, like season 4, like year 4, I was like, oh, I'll do a few more like solo episodes. Like I'll do, talk about like the Rambo series or X, Y, and Z. And I was like, I need like a bit of back and forth. Like, I don't like the sound of my own voice. It's hard to talk for an hour by yourself. Like, listen to one of your recent State of the Union address, but you had a guest on. Like, it's hard just to ramble along and just talk about nothing, unless you have a script, which I don't like using scripts. It seems like really forced, and you sound a bit robotic if you're like reading.
So anyway, we have to address the bright light that brought the Mother load to your podcast. So you've recently sort of started talking about video games a bit more, specifically Doom, which is, I guess, our mutual interest here.
Absolutely.
How did that come about? Yeah.
Well, it's a bit strange. Like, so it was maybe like in March this year. I was just on like Twitter and I saw Romero Games was like, or maybe it was John Romero himself was like, I have a Discord server. And I had just been on Discord for about a year, and I wasn't really doing much. I had like my own little small server. And I was like, oh, this is kind of pointless. There isn't many people in it. And, I feel like I'm just talking to an empty room kind of thing. And started joining like a few mid-sized ones. So Romero Games was the first one. And I was just like chatting away in that. And I was quite active in that one. And then got approached by the moderation team. And they were like, hey, do you want to be a mod? And I was like, yeah, okay. That sounds fun. I enjoy being here. Don't think it would be anything extra. And then maybe another month or two went by, and it was kind of like, hey, do you want to be an admin? So I was like, yeah, I suppose, like, not going to change much either. So became like an admin there. And it was kind of funny because starting the podcast day one, the Romeros there in Galway, Ireland. So I knew they were there. And I was like, wow, I'd love to interview those guys. So I was back and forth. I got into a back and forth with Brenda Romero back in 2016 to try and get a date to interview them. And it was like, yeah, what time suits? John's away this week, but whenever. And I emailed them back and I didn't get any response. And I know they're quite busy, so I didn't think anything of it. So it was kind of like in a roundabout way, the podcast, I wouldn't say started because I wanted to talk with them, but it was like definitely I wanted them to be like in the first 10 episodes sort of thing. So it was more like then, since that was obviously very Doom adjacent, like the Romeros kind of hang their hat that they were involved with Doom. Like I won't mince my words and say like it isn't tied to Doom. And then I was, Bridgeburner was there, and I was like, oh, he's like a mod over on the official Doom Discord. And not through him, but through someone else, I got introduced to that mod team, and they were short of space. So I'm also a mod on the official Doom Discord. And that place is very full of angry people. There's lots of silly things being posted, to put it lightly. So that needs a bit of a big mod team. So yeah, and then video games, I was like, look, I want to play a bit more games. I haven't played in years. I just recently got like the Xbox Series X. And last year I spoke with like Stephen Kick of Night Dive Studios. He's the CEO. And I inherently find it really interesting because I play a lot of games as a youth. I do really enjoy gaming. I always wanted to talk with game developers, and more so this year than like Bridgeburner. We were like chatting away, and I was like, well, you actually are making games. So started chatting with him. As we just mentioned, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I did speak with John Romero. Speaking with you now as well, like a Doom adjacent podcast. And it is all centering around Doom. But I wouldn't say it just started for me in April with Doom. Like I've always really enjoyed it. There's a bit of a je ne sais quoi about Doom, I think, because just the music, the sprite work, the gameplay, aesthetically, it just like all fits together, and it's still infinitely playable, literally, because there's so many WODs and mods and everything. That, like, my first port was on the Game Boy Advance.
Oh,
and I thought that was like a 1-to-1 port, because I didn't know anything when I was young about different ports. I thought like, everything was 1-to-1. And then my uncle-in-law, he was giving me Doom 2. Well, he didn't give it to me, but at his place he had Doom 2 on DOS. So I remember playing the first few levels on that, and I was like, oh my god, that double barrel shotgun, super shotgun, unbelievable. And that was like really interesting. And then my friend got the Super Nintendo port, and we played so much of that, and we thought that was like 1-to-1, like unbelievable. And I just always like adjacently like was really fascinated by id Software. Like I was really following Doom 3 when that was coming out in like 2003, following like on the gaming magazines. And I was like, oh my god, those graphics, like they look so realistic. And I remember like could not wait for the Doom movie to come out in 2005. It was December 2005, I remember, and I had like really crappy phone, but it was like had the poster as like my screensaver, and just always fascinated with Doom. So it's always like carried through with me. And then on like the Xbox Live Arcade, they had a port, played so much of that, like 2007. And then it really took a back seat until like Doom 2016.
Yeah.
And that absolutely blew me away. Like I think Doom 2016 is in my top 5 games of all time. It just completely reinvigorated like first person shooters for me compared to years and years of like military shooters like Call of Duty, which felt like just really rote and formulaic and boring. And this was like, oh my God, because I never played Quake or anything up until the re-release this year. So I wasn't too familiar with that like really fast paced sort of gaming. And it just blew me away. Graphics, everything. I was like, this feels like Doom in 2016. Like it really felt like they transported what Doom should have been and they put it up here. And Doom Eternal, much better game, but it's only iterative from Doom 2016. So I wouldn't put it like higher than Doom 2016 for like the impact. And yeah, I've been like kind of following in the background, and I'm sure all listening on your side of the show, like we all love Doom. And I don't know, it's a bit like, I hate like saying like I'm a fan or whatever, but it's like kind of cringy, but it's such a good franchise. I just love the simplicity of like the demons came from hell and you just have to kill them. It's something so like visceral and base about it that is like
archetypical.
Yeah, it's like amazing. And there's not like, obviously in the new Dooms there's so much like lore they're trying to pack in. It's like you don't need lore. It's just like demons came from hell. Everyone has the idea of like hell, like pretty much from like Dante's Inferno is kind of that vibe. And it just really works. Yeah, it's archetypical, as you said.
I was asked, it was probably like a couple years ago, maybe now. I'm not sure how long ago it was. There's these guys who did a really cool podcast called The Lore Party, and they would essentially dive into not just games, but sometimes just like movies or whatever, and like talk about all of the lore and everything that's kind of behind the scenes of it. And they were really good at it. And when Doom Eternal was, so it was about that long ago, I guess, when it was getting ready to come out, they were starting to do a lot of Doom content, and they asked me to come on the show as like a guest expert on the story of Doom.
Yeah.
And what I ended up kind of bringing to the table was that I absolutely despise the way that Doom Eternal handles the Doom lore. It's just like, ugh, it's too much. But because what makes it special
I would agree.
was the fact that it was so vague and so mysterious that any little nugget you got, like down to just like weird shit that John Romero would say online, became part of the story, and the players got to make it up for themselves and like really form it into this giant thing where now, I mean, we started talking about how like Commander Keen and BJ Blazkowicz and Doom Guy and now Doom Slayer are all technically like a lineage, like family tree sort of thing going on there, and even Quake Guy to some extent. And I don't know, I found that so much more interesting than just talking about, well, according to the thing that you find out in level 3 or whatever.
Oh, it's just more
explicitly tell you.
More fun. Like it's just it's like any sort of sequelization though, where they're like, oh, we got to expand. Like I think one of the more prime examples recently, in just to get away from Doom for a breather, is like if anyone has watched like the John Wick franchise, the series of films with Keanu Reeves. So the first movie was so vague on what the backstory was, and your imagination is better than anything they could put on screen. John Wick 2, they did a little bit more on the lore side of like where he came from and the like pretty much the Assassin's Guild, pretty much. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, it's a little bit more. And it's like, all right. And then John Wick 3 was like crazy, just giving away way too much. And you're like, oh, that's it. Is that all? Like, and it was the same with The Matrix. Like I was rewatching that recently, another Keanu Reeves vehicle. First movie, really vague of like what Zion is. And it was maybe didn't exist, or, you know, there was all these questions of maybe it was another fantasy. And then for the next two movies, it was like, you know, kind of a crusty hippie rave party in a cave. And you're like, what? Like, this is what I thought it was going to be. So like, to wrap around to Doom Eternal, it was like, no, I don't need like the, you know, the Ghost King and all these Seraphants and whatever, like running around. I'm like, oh, I just want to kill demons and listen to heavy metal. Like, that's all I want.
Since it's around about Halloween time now, like that's another good example too. It's like the original Halloween, it to me, and I appreciate Zombies' take on it, but you know, what made Michael Myers so cool is that it was just this super vague, like he's an entity, and then
The shape.
Zombies Halloween makes him into a person.
Yeah.
And that just, while it's very interesting and I enjoyed exploring that part of Michael Myers, it's not scary. And that's this. I don't know if you've seen Halloween Kills yet, but they sort of.
No, it's not out till the 28th here.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, let me know when you see it, and I won't spoil anything for anyone.
No, I'm actually
quite
looking to watch that on the 31st, to watch it actually on Halloween. Like Halloween,
Nice.
speaking over in the month of the Spooktober, I love Halloween. It's originally an Irish festival, Samhain, yeah. So yeah, I love it. Like in Ireland, it's quite big, but I make a bigger deal of it. I actually have a pumpkin ready to be carved. Australians don't do it too much because it's like the southern hemisphere, so it gets like brighter and hotter in October. Like we're in the middle of spring now, so people are like, oh, we don't do Halloween. I was speaking to one of my colleagues, he was like, oh, we shut the doors and turn off the lights, like we don't want any kids coming around. I'm like, but it's trick-or-treating. I was like, you have the wrong festival, you're not Scrooge. Bah humbug. But yeah, I love Halloween as a quick aside.
I love I love both aspects of it, like the original sort of Northern European pagan backstory to what it really is and all that. It's very much like it's in my head all the time. But I also loved when I was a kid dressing up as Gene Simmons and carrying a bass guitar around and like splattering blood on people out of my mouth and whatever. Like that was hilarious. And I liked candy when I was a kid too. So it's pretty dope.
Absolutely.
America, we do Halloween hard. We go real hard on Halloween, but it's like anything else, it's a commercial holiday.
Yeah, like, I mean, you know, all the depictions of Halloween in like media where it's pretty much like New England, all the autumnal colors. Like, I want to do that. I want to go around and see, I don't know, is, you know, like those movies, like where there's hundreds of kids in costume, like walking on the streets. I don't know, is that actually real? But I'd love to kind of see it. Yeah. No, I'd like...
We would, like I said, we grew up kind of like rural and poor, so we would drive to the rich neighborhood for Halloween too. We'd go, like, these people give away full bars, bro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't much kids on my street. So like, it might only be, you know, myself and my sister and maybe like two other kids, but everyone made an effort though, because they were like, oh, these are the 2 or 3 kids who go around on the street. So later on then we used to go to like my friend's house, and not many trick-or-treaters, I guess it was like really cold in October. I don't know, it was strange. And for a while there it was like, you know, 3 or 4 years in a row wearing like the Scream mask, the ghost face. It was like very popular. But yeah, like, because we used to do all the traditional stuff like bopping for apples and all those kind of little parlor games, I suppose. But yeah, no, it's really fun. Halloween is a great time, and it does tie in to like Quake and everything like that. That's all like Lovecraftian and all spooky things, because Halloween, like Samhain, Harvest Festival, and it's meant to be like the thinning of the veil, because it's when night overtakes the light. So it's where like ghosts and ghoulies are like most active, because they can come through the veil, like come through the void sort of thing.
Right.
Is kind of where it comes from. And we all dress up and carve pumpkins to kind of scare away those spirits, like back to the underworld, I suppose. And that's just always like a fascinating take on it, because just a little more history. Like Halloween night in Irish is Ihe Samhain. So it's like Halloween night. But November in Irish is Samhain. So it's like the night before November.
Yeah.
Which is where it gets its name. So I know in a few of the Halloween movies, they came up with a character, Sam Hain, just like Samuel Hain, but it's like Samhain. Is that what it actually stands for? So
it gets called Sam Hain in at least in American English all the time, but it's also from there's a rock band called Sam Hain, and they called it they pronounced it that way, which was Glenn Danzig's band after the Misfits, which they kicked ass, but regardless.
Yeah, no, it's like I love it. I could talk about Halloween all day, every day. Like the last 6 years, I've done like tried to do 31 horror movies in 31 days. It's like a thing lots of people do online. So this year's theme is No Escape, because last year's theme was the pandemic, and we're still in like lockdown here. So it's all like movies like Escape Room or, Final Destination and stuff I've been doing the last couple of weeks. So if you want to follow that, follow at the Fear Merchant on Twitter until the end of the month.
That's at Fear Merchant.
Yeah. So there we go. Get my plugs in.
Is it the Fear Merchant or just Fear Merchant?
It's the Fear Merchant. The definitive.
The Fear Merchant.
Yeah. I'm the only Fear Merchant in town.
I don't know if it's just a matter of how long you've been doing it or whatever, but you've been really successful on social media, at least compared to us and our little thing. It took me 2 years to get like 1,000 followers.
Yeah, it used to be easier back in the day. So, definitely dropped off. Like it used to be way higher. But I've kind of been pulling back from social media a lot.
Yeah.
Around like probably 2 years ago, I was just like got really burnt out. It was around the time when I just moved down to Australia, and I was like really trying to grow the brand, and I felt like I was completely spinning the wheels like on a treadmill kind of thing, and I was like, this is going nowhere. That I was just like, I'm just going to unfollow like, loads of people, X, Y, and Z, just like really cut back, because I was getting no results from it. And I was more, if I was just, I think the key to success, and it's very intangible, and I wouldn't say by any means I'm successful, but it's more like if you can get people to say, I'm listening to this podcast, I really like it, you should have a listen. Like that's how you grow. I don't think anyone's like really grown from like social media, because there's loads of podcast accounts, and they might, even one yesterday was like, hey, like, just new to Twitter, joined Twitter in September 2021, and they're like, hey, episode 2 is out, like have a listen. I'm like, I know you're just two guys drinking beer podcast, like I'm not listening to that. And I don't know, I've never clicked a podcast from just seeing it on Twitter, just personally. So I have to think of it the other way around, that no one's going to listen to me on Twitter. It's handy just to get the links out there, but I feel it's like shouting out the window sometimes.
I think it's just creating a body of work. So it's like if someone finds In the Keep on Twitter and then they look, what is this? And then they see what it is, then that'll, it's like the rule of 7 in marketing. Like the more they see it, the more they're likely to remember it, and the more they're likely to quote, buy it or, go check it out. Yeah. And it's also important to note that In the Keep's not just the podcast, right? So like we're putting up our game trailers and whatever. The podcast is the vast majority of our output at this point, but when we start shipping games, it'll be more like, hopefully like the New Blood Twitter, or something like that.
Yeah, because we're definitely meandering today, which is usually good for us, but maybe not good for listeners. But you're working with 3D Realms, which is, for those who don't know my end, like that is a staple name in the boomer shooter realm, like with Duke Nukem and the likes. How did you come to working with them all the way over in Arizona?
Well, a while back, I was trying my best to basically, I was doing a lot of boomer shooter stuff on the podcast, and I ended up getting, I think Fred maybe came first, either him or Stephen Kick, one of the two. But a young lady who was a fan of the show and also really helpful in our Discord community and everything, she found him at PAX. Fred Schreiber being the CEO of 3D Realms now. At the time, I think he was the vice president, but that's changed. And she walked up to him and said, like, hey, you should be on this podcast, probably amongst other conversation that went on there. And he was like, yeah, sure, whatever. Tell him to send me a message. So I did. Like, that sounds awesome. I'd love to interview Fred. He's a fucking hero in the world of game development. And so I interviewed him. And that was it. It was really cool. And I very much enjoyed having him as a guest. And then I think a few months go by and he had dreamed up this idea of what would become Realms Deep.
Yep.
Which is, 3D Realms has their own, for the past 2 years now, convention. It's mostly online because, pandemic shit, but hopefully that'll change in the next year or so. And he was like, we wanted to like interview all these amazing people like John Romero and American McGee and Tim Willits and John St. John and Chuck Jones and I think Cliffy B. And yeah, how was I going to say no to that? Like, fuck yeah, I'll produce those interviews.
Absolutely.
Just tell me when.
Give me the contacts after Ty.
So yeah, we do that. And over the course of the planning period, I sort of just became the de facto recruiter of the indie games, right? Because they were going to show off all the stuff from New Blood and Night Dive and I think Destructive Creations, Running with Scissors. But I was just like, I know all these like really great indie developers who have games that I think fit into this really well. And then I ended up managing all of that. And I think that just proved that I had management skills. And then I, over the past year or so, got into, I would say, project management in games anyway, because I'm working on Call of Ragnar with Damian and those guys, and then I brought them under the In the Keep umbrella, and then we started making our own game called Stellar Valkyrie, which is another Doom engine shooter. Mm-hmm. And by that point, I'm like, well, I don't have anything published yet, but I have a body of work that says like I can do this. So when I flew to Denmark this past summer for this year's Realms Deep, I was far more into like the actual management of how the convention was going to go anyway. And at that point, Fred and I had a discussion and he was like, I think we could really use you here. So I came back home and I applied for this program in the military that allows you to basically do like an internship while the military pays for it. And you can go work full time for another company for up to 6 months.
Right.
So that you don't end up homeless on the streets when you get out. Yeah. Yeah. So it worked. My commander thought it was a great idea, or at least he stomached it. So yeah, for the past couple of weeks, I've been kind of onboarding and learning how they do business, how their project management stuff works. And I'm really enjoying it. And I think it's not only, amazing that I get to walk away and have a job when I get out, but also that I get this opportunity. I never went to college. Like I went to college for like one class and I was like, fuck this. This is lame. I'm going to get paid to just continue to advance my skills as a producer for games, which is what I want to do anyway.
Yeah. So you're
pretty epic.
$100,000 richer from not going to college in the States by all accounts.
Yes, of course. And
better for it, I'm sure. Like sounds like dream job. Yeah. No, cause like it kind of sounds, you're almost like very similar to the Bazaar sort of concept of like get in indie people and show their wares. And now you've managed to actually get a job out of it, which is amazing, especially with 3D Realms, like such a well-known name. I'd say you're kind of over the moon with that.
Well, I would say that 3D Realms is mostly made of everyone who works there are people who were modders or indie game developers before they came to work there. I mean, that's how you get into the game. Anybody out there who thinks that you get into the game industry by going to college for a bachelor's degree in video games is, I'm not saying you won't find work, but that's not going to be the reason. It's like any job really, especially in software of any kind.
Need your body of work.
They care about what you could do. Yeah. They don't care about what your degree says.
Yeah, exactly.
And Fred, he got his start from making Duke Nukem Reloaded, which he pitched to 3D Realms way back in the day, while Duke Forever was about to come out. So they, shot it down and it didn't happen. And then, when they went out of business because of how shitty their game was, he bought the company.
It was his two fingers. Duke Nukem Forever wasn't that bad. It was like 6 out of 10. I played it on Xbox.
It was a big enough failure financially that they went out. And then Randy Pitchford bought the Duke Nukem IP, and the rest is history. But we'll see where that goes from now. And I think that there's a lot of hope in the world for modders and indie game developers to kind of rise to the top, because those are the people doing the hard work. And I think that it was very important. It was made explicitly important to me when we were planning Realms Deep that Fred wanted to show off indie games big time. And it's the only convention that I'm aware of really where it's not like E3, nobody's paying to get in. It's like, this is just him putting out his generosity. It's good marketing for him and all the other companies involved in it. And for every single one of these indie guys, it's like a huge opportunity for them to get their name out there, to sell their game and, network with people. And I love that part of it.
No, absolutely. Because I think it's definitely getting into like a golden age. I think I mentioned this with Bridgeburner, that like Doom now is going to be 30 years old in like 2 years time, we'll say. Mm-hmm. That the likes of us and, like late 20s, early 30s, sort of, pretty much like 25 to 35 bracket. It's just in the time frame now where like we grew up with these games and now we're old enough to make them. So it's like a new, I suppose if it was the golden age, would it be in the silver age? How does it work? Probably the golden age, because there's more people now. There's more people played them to make them than there was making them at the start. So it's a really good time to play, because I hadn't played Quake until this year. And that was kind of like, wow, that was like really fun to play. I was like, I get it. I get why like Dusk and stuff is coming out, because it's so fun. I'm like, it's so much more fun than playing like realistic shooters and stuff and cover shooters. And it's just like, no, I just want to run around and gib things. It's just so visceral. And I think it's just going back to the simplicity we were saying of like the original Doom, of just like the sprite work, the music, the gore, just like, oh, this just hits on your absolute lizard brain of just being like, wow, I just love doing this. And some of the stuff that I've seen coming out through Realms Deep and everything, I'm like, yeah, they're all in a certain engine, but everything is in Unreal Engine, but there's so many different games. Everything is in Unity. There's so many different games. Even the bloody like Nintendo game kit developer, like people are coming up with crazy stuff in that game. So I'm like, just because it's in the Doom engine, I think a lot of people pass it off as, oh, that's just, you put a HUD skin over like the base game or something. I'm like, no, it's a brand new game. Like, you can't discount it. And I think because I was ignorant like that for a while until I was in the scene the last few months. I actually thought it was just like, oh yeah, that's just, you're modding the base game. But yeah, I was definitely wrong. I'm like getting to chat and with really cool people, and just, even like the multiplayer side of things, the source port wars and all these things that I'm like learning about. I'm like, can't we all just get along and just enjoy it? Like, I'm fairly diplomatic when it comes to things. Like, I don't have a strong opinion either way. I'm just like, if it works, if it's fun, if it has a community. And I think what people are growing is fantastic, like within the community, like what you do, interviewing all the indie developers. You're like literally in 3D Realms now, doing Realms Deep. The more we can like grow the network, as you said, like kind of gives me like hope, because there was like a lot of doom and gloom. Not to use the word doom, but a lot of doom and gloom like the last 2 years with the pandemic and stuff. But when you see like just people creating and just trooping on and building community, like I think community is probably one of the things that's lacking the most these days for people. And I wouldn't say like I've found my place or anything, but I definitely feel cozy in the embrace of the boomer shooter community as a whole. I think it's generally speaking a really nice place to be. And I think if anyone's listening and you're interested in just joining the discussion, there's plenty of Discords, plenty happening on Twitter. Everyone's really approachable. Like, Stephen Kick of Night Dive, he's one of the chillest dudes, really active on Twitter and stuff. You can just pretty much message him and be like, do you want an interview? And I think he pretty much says yes to everyone. He's like guerrilla marketing kind of guy. And just things like that. I'm just like, it has been building. Like, to go back to one of your earlier questions of like, how did you get into just interviewing gaming people? It's like, because they're really chill and they pretty much say yes. Because did like G-Man, and he was like, oh, you should speak with Stephen Kick. I was like, all right. And it was by no means an introduction through G-Man. I just messaged Stephen Kick and he was like, yeah, sure. And I was like, wow, this is easy. And yeah, I'm going to do more. It's just with the time zones, like as you saw yourself this week, like it has to be, Saturday or Sunday morning. I try to keep people's weekends as like absolutely sacrosanct, because they're pretty much sacrosanct for me. So it's like, oh, are you available like on Friday afternoon? Is pretty much the only time slot. Like really hamstrung by time zones, because obviously working 9 to 5, I can't just slot it in the middle of my week and stuff. So it's kind of tough to get the interviews in. But I'm glad we got to chat today.
Part of me has a desire to be that way, but in reality, I'm just like, anytime, any day, I will wake up or go to sleep or whatever the fuck. I'll ruin my life to try to get
that's the difference. That's the difference, because we're both the hosts, so we accommodated each other this week. But I try not to get anyone's weekend unless they're open to it. And that's really been a struggle for me to get interviews. Like I've definitely had a few people fall off, and I've had quote unquote like bigger names and stuff like fall through because of like timing and stuff. So it's never worth mentioning the fish that you didn't catch. So
I've been trying to get G-Man to do something for Realms Deep for 2 years in a row, and he's just a busy motherfucker from what I can tell. He's like,
sure. He's involved in
the conversation.
Yeah, he's involved in that new first-person shooter documentary, which I was like, what the hell? How did he get on that roster? Like, Creator VC, that company, way before the first-person shooter one, they did like the 80s horror. In Search of Darkness Part 1 and 2.
I had those guys on the show for Realms Deep this past year.
Yeah, because were you speaking with David Weiner at all? The director for that?
Robin.
Oh, Robin Wright,
Robin Block.
Oh, Block, sorry. Robin Wright's that actress. Yeah. Robin Block. Yeah, I think he's the owner of it, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so...
From what I understand.
But even before that, David Weiner was the director for that. That was back in he was the editor for Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. And I had him on the show, and I've had him on multiple times. We just hit it off. So it's like the horror, the FPS and horror and the indie horror and everything. It's all like tying in together. Yeah. Kind of crazy that it's all connected really online. Like for Creator VC to the FPS, who are speaking with G-Man, John Romero, the other directors were In Search of Darkness, who I also had on. Like, and I'm by no means like Joe Rogan, kind of a small enough outfit, but it's like you just see the same names popping up when you're in scenes, I guess. Do you find it the same?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of networking, is like kind of uncovering those little connecting trails that are linking everyone together, because, like it's literally, I could trace it back. My career trajectory, at least through the podcast, is like, because I talked to Andrew Holschult at QuakeCon, I was then able to, he's so like well liked and known and involved in so many different companies and indie games and everything, that is like, he knows everyone. And so once I asked someone like David Szymanski, who made Dusk, I'm like, hey, would you like to be on the show? And I'm like, and before you make a decision, please look back through the catalog and see if it's something that you are interested in doing at all. And he's like, oh, you had Andrew on? I love Andrew. Yeah, we'll do it. And that has happened so many times since then. So, I mean, and then when you're talking to somebody who's like mid-tier or I would say like beginning, sometimes they're really hesitant to do these things. But I'm like, and I don't mean for this to sound like a jackass, but like, you kind of be an idiot to not be on the same platform as your heroes. And if they go back through the catalog and they see John Romero, Fred Schreiber, David Oshry, like just you'd be nuts to not take that opportunity to get some good marketing in, and that's kind of how it happens. And
yeah, because I'm not too sure. Does it go back to what we were saying of just like you need to kind of just take a punt, I guess? Because I imagine when you do reach out to people, they're like, do you want to do an interview? like there actually isn't that many people asking the same through like a fear.
Yep. It's the pretty girl effect.
Yeah, it is, because
she's so hot that guys are too intimidated to ask her out, so she never gets asked to prom.
I think that's how it sort of works, and it just asks the question, like, to quote Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, and that's never more true than if you don't ask her. Maybe you have to ask, every couple of months or something. The email could have got lost, or you have to kind of do your different strikes at different times.
People will ask me often, like, how did you get this person on the show? And I'm like, you know what? When it's 3 a.m. and I've had a few beers, I don't give a shit if they don't message me back.
That's my message. That's my method as well. Like, if on Twitter after a few beers, I'm like, now I have the courage to message, like, hey, bitch, get on the show. And
Exactly.
That's worked out a lot for me. So I wouldn't take our advice, the collective advice here. But yeah, no, it definitely helps a few times. I sent a few cringy messages before that got left on read. I'm like, oh no.
Oh man, I've written some very, very questionable emails.
Yeah, I'm like, I love you, baby.
Pouring my heart out to someone like that. I messaged Chris Ryan. I don't know if you've ever listened to Tangentially Speaking podcast.
I have not.
This is unrelated to our podcast. He's a really, really great podcaster. I really love his show, but he oftentimes will read short stories or poems that people send him on the show. So I sent him like the first draft of a short story I wrote, and like with another additional paragraph of like, I'm just such a big, like, all that kind of shit. And like, well, no wonder he didn't message me back. Who the fuck does that? Like, but it's just not having the fear. I think that's important because, like you said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, and I will take every single shot I can. Because honestly, when I see someone who's like working on something that I really admire, and I think that what they're doing is special, like, it's worth it to try the best I can to connect. I don't see any reason not to.
No, absolutely.
So I am curious, when you sit down to interview someone, how do you, like, is there a process to that? Do you sit down and research every detail of them beforehand, or do you just kind of wing it and see what you find throughout?
It really depends. At the start, when it was the independent people, largely the stuff we were talking about was like literally their first thing they've ever produced. So that was they were really like protective of that. And I'm never a gotcha interviewer. I'm not about that at all. I'm all about the networking, as we were talking about. I don't burn bridges at all, to drop that phrase. I always keep the door open. I'm very diplomatic with everything. I, as far as I know, don't have any enemies. I try not to make any. I am not quick to anger, be rash or anything. So when I'm talking with those guys at the start, it was just teasing it out. I'm like, yeah, how did you get into it? What you do? Much like I asked you, like, who are you basically? How did you get to this point? And that's sort of how I've operated. And then if it's someone like a little bit bigger, like I had on, have you ever seen like Cube, that horror movie?
No, but my friend Ben was telling me that I needed to watch it because he has some kind of crazy idea about.
Yeah, so there's like Cube, and have you seen The Witch, that was spelled with 2 V's?
I have seen Witch, yeah.
Yeah, so the composer for those two, Mark Corbin, I was like, do you know what? He's on Twitter. I'll get his email address. Emailed him. I was like, hey, Mark, loved your work in X, Y, and Z. And he came back and like, yeah, sure, do a podcast. And I was just like chatting away with him. Seemed like a really chill guy. And I just asked him at the end, I was like, Mark, why did you want to do the podcast? And he was just like, oh, you just asked really nicely. Sounded good. And we just like went through like, again, like what you do, like how many instruments do you have, what you like playing. And if for anyone listening, you try and look up the Apprehension Engine. He came up with this demonic instrument for like movie scores. You'll definitely know the sounds. And through the process then, like as maybe people get bigger, like I look through other interviews and I might listen to like one or two, and if it's like everyone doing the same thing, like, oh, tell us about that really famous thing that you did, and it's like, oh, look, I'm not going to ask about that. I want to try and tease out other things that maybe people haven't heard, and maybe they've answered it on, you know, the other 100 interviews I didn't listen to. But I just want to know these things. It's not about the audience when I'm talking. I don't normally do like listener questions because normally they're really like mundane and they're not in the mindset of doing the interview. And I feel like listener questions can be really out of place sometimes on the flow of the conversation. I definitely just like to have a conversation. So I might have like a few touch points that I want to ask. And then if they say something like a little nugget that I want to pull a little bit more, I'll dive into it. Like for some interviews, it might be like a 2-hour time slot, but they're really busy and they say like, I can actually only do an hour. So mentally there's like 10 questions we'll say, and there might be that might turn into 20 questions through pulling the threads. But then mentally I have to like chop it down to like, okay, this is the hour. So we're doing like the turbo mode of like, I'll cut these questions, I'll cut the follow-ups. Because I don't know, do people like listening to all the filler or not? Maybe some people like the snappy 30-40 minutes, highly produced. Some people like the 3 hours absolutely raw, where you hear like the dogs barking and the helicopters in the background and the fire engine. So I just try and have a conversation. I rarely edit out anything unless, you know, we have like a brain fart or, you know, the cat comes in and knocks over the mic or, you know, anything like that. It's just like, I try and have it as close to the conversation as we had. Very rarely am I asked to cut something out because, as I said, I'm not a gotcha person. But sometimes it's like, can you please edit that out? I think that will cause me hassle. And that's all fine. I'm not like, no, this is mine now to put out. And because, you know, am I going to tag like, you know, TMZ or the Daily Mail or something? Like, who's going to want to get this nugget from relatively, you know, I don't think I've had any superstars on, we'll say, like actual, you know, Scarlett Johansson or anything like that. It's like, why would I do this to people? So it's normally just like a conversation. What about you? Like, what's your sort of thought process when sitting down?
I'll say, I mean, there is some difference in how much I prepare based on who it is. Like if I'm going to have someone on who I know, I just know them or I know their body of work like really, really well. I don't do any preparation. I just show up with a beer and I'm like, let's go and see what happens. And I hate time constraints. When somebody said like, I only have an hour, which is fine. I get that. That's part of the business. But like, I really, for my mental health, need the conversation to flow and go its natural course. Yeah. I don't know why it's like an obsession of mine, but I just don't like those, you know, okay, well, this is an hour and we're going to wrap it up, because I always feel like a conversation, unless it's with someone that you already really know anyway, doesn't really start flowing until about maybe 45 minutes in, sometimes longer, you know, to get someone to really drop their guard and just be a person instead. And that's why I encourage, like, hey, if you want to drink a beer, you do it. You need to smoke a joint, I don't care. Do it while we're talking. Whatever gets you comfortable and not just putting this, you know, guard up. I noticed that a bit in your interview with Stephen Kick, because in the beginning, it starts off very similar to the way that he was when he was on In the Keep, where it's, you know, the same sort of, you know, well, I started the company because we were on this trip in Mexico.
Yeah, it's very
and all, you know, all that
rehearsed. Yeah.
Well, but I mean, that's his story, you know, and he said it so many times but after that, then you started doing that massaging thing where you get all the deep, cool thoughts out of them. And that's awesome, but it takes some time. I'd say like there are some that I have done a lot of research for, specifically because I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to fuck anything up, or that I, you know, that I had some insight onto how does this person think. That way we can kind of hit the ground running. A good example of that would have been like, I had Disaster Piece on the show one time and he was amazing, but I listened to like hours and hours and hours of like speeches that he's given at different gaming conventions about, you know, music composition and sound design. And I just wanted to make sure that I like had some understanding of what it is that he does, because sound design is such a bizarre business to be in, especially in video games. And I was also a huge fan of his. Like I loved the soundtrack to It Follows. I literally I remember sitting in a room with my friend who'd bought it on a vinyl record and just like, this is the most amazing horror soundtrack I've ever heard.
Yeah, good movie too.
That. Yeah. And one of the things that you said a few minutes ago that kind of hit me was that this insistence on being really open and honest with your guest and accommodating them. Because if they say something they wish they hadn't said and you just do them that favor to, yeah, we'll clean that up. Again, you're not burning a bridge. They're going to respect you and they're going to look at you as they'll probably come back at some point, and when they do another big damn project that might get you more people listening to your show and they say, this is one of the places where I feel comfortable marketing my shit, it's going to be good for you. It's a very karma sort of concept in my head.
It is.
One thing that happened recently was somebody on Twitter was harassing Sergeant Mark IV, saying you did all these horrible things in the Brutal Doom guy for people who are not tracking listening. And then his response to them was literally he took the link to his appearance on In the Keep and said, you obviously didn't listen to this. And then that was the end of it.
Yeah.
And that made me really proud. I was like, that means I did my job well, if he feels comfortable doing that.
Yeah. I guess as an interviewer, and you did a great job of that episode, and for any of your new listeners or my guys, just even for a little piece of internet history, I think it's kind of important that people listen to that. You really came in there unbiased, I felt, and I think that's a key thing when you're interviewing, because you need to just separate the art from the artist, really. I was talking about this with my wife yesterday. I was just I love a good Kevin Spacey movie, but he's a bit of a piece of work outside of the movies, just let people, let people speak for what they are. I wouldn't talk to Kevin Spacey now. Well, maybe I would. Maybe that would be funny to have.
I could try it. I think I could try it, but I don't think that I would be able to just pretend what happened didn't happen, if that makes sense.
But I think the characters he plays, just as a quick aside, the fact he is such a creeper and a piece of work, I'm oh no, you're really selling me on this, because you are a creep. It nearly makes his appearances better. Maybe I'm really macabre with that. But no, I think just with the interviews, it's good to be kind of at least have the appearance of being unbiased, and don't weight your questions, I think is a really big one, because I just like to keep things open-ended, and if people want to answer, sometimes I might wrap back around if I, quote unquote, wasn't happy with their answer. I might try and phrase it another way just in case they weren't on the same wavelength as me with the question. Because sometimes it might just be a really quick one. And I'm no, just to go back with this, blah, 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 change the question a bit.
Yeah.
I can't really think of too many examples. I had one guy on before, probably one of my favorite chats. He's an ex-CIA operator. His name was Basil Baz. So it was Basil Baz on the Bazaar. It was quite a mouthful.
It's a badass.
It's
a very badass name.
Yeah, but it was crazy because we were watching a show, and he was just a random background character that appeared every 5 episodes, barely any voice lines. And I was this guy looks like a badass. I was I'm going to see, can I track him down? And it turned out then he's ex-CIA. He rescues children from kidnappers and stuff all around the States. And I'm oh my God, he's just a random background character in this show. The Blacklist, actually. He was a mercenary. And I'm what the hell? What's this world of... It's kind of when you find out when you're young that other people actually have their own living life and consciousness. There's so much more happening outside your own bubble. I'm
yep.
If he's just a background character, what's everyone else's backstory? So it's kind of what you were saying earlier, you appreciate where I just talk to the man on the street, because it could be oh, hey, you sell apples, and it's oh yeah, but I'm a veteran and I did X amount of tours, and you're what? Everyone has their own secret story, I think, and that's what I try and tease out of people, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
The chances are that the guy walking down the street is far more interesting than like the person in your mind who you think is super interesting, right? They've never told their story half the time. You know, they have so much more to say, and it's just like waiting to come out of them. You never know. And as you said, like I love when I talk to someone and I realize that they have this entire separate life that is completely unrelated to what I thought was their, you know, their magnum opus or what they're known for.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I love trying to get out. It's like, oh yeah, you're known for this, but like, you know, what have you been doing the other 30 years? Or there's always more to the story, I guess.
I think it's about time for you to go hang out with your sister, brother.
I think so.
Your sister, brother. Your sister, comma, brother.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
No,
I know I said I hate time constraints, but I will respect yours because you've been so good to me and you woke up super early for this. So this has been really cool, and I think we should try to do it sometime again in the future.
No, definitely. Simulcast. I don't know. You'll probably release it sooner than I'll have time to edit. So maybe it'll be a staggered cast.
I've got like a month's worth of podcasts sitting there waiting to be released. So you just tell me what date and we'll stamp it together.
I'll get the edit done as soon as so. Who wants to wrap up the podcast then?
I love you. The drowned god Cathala loves you. And until next time, stay in the bazaar. Big thank you to Richard for coming on the show, man. What a great experience just getting to pick his brain and see how someone with obviously years more podcasting experience than myself goes about doing their business and just talking games, man, talking movies, talking all life. I really love that shit, man. And I hope you go check out the Bazaar Cast. It is really good. He's got a lot of fantastic guests, many of which that we've mentioned on here, and just good content in general. Show him some love from the Drowned God. I gotta say thank you to all of our supporters. Shannon, Ben, Bridge, Anthony, Mike, Zan, Lord Revan, Fred, Brandy, Jack, Robert, Graceless Dragon, Red Eyes, Brad, Dots, Moose, Paul, the entire Flam Fam, Erock Simon, and Immorpher. I love all of you, and thank you for keeping the lights on here at In the Keep podcast. I'll never be able to say thank you enough to you guys. I implore anyone listening to this who is interested in the Keep and enjoyed this episode. Maybe you're new because you're here from the Bazaar Cast side of things. Yeah, definitely go to inthekeep.com. There's all kinds of ways that you can get involved in the community, like joining the Discord and following on Twitter and all that nonsense. You can also head over to our merch tab if you want to grab some swag. We got that. And, of course, there's a support thing, and I'll read your name off like everyone else. You'll get early episodes of the podcast and a little bit more interaction, a chance to ask a question for certain guests and all that kind of thing. Whatever I can do to make your life a little better for helping us out, I will I will reach around my back, grab my elbow, and try to do my very best to make you all happy supporters. It makes me happy when you're happy. That's it for me this week. I love you. The Drowned God Cathala loves you. And until next time, stay in the motherfucking keep.